Now I will talk about the relationship between speech acts and the society in which they are performed. Usually, speech acts are assumed to have been performed in a certain situation, in a context or a society, and they take a lot of energy from the context in which they are performed. In the beginning, I'll talk about the social dimensions of speech acts because these social dimensions perform sometimes the most vital role in determining the meaning of a speech act. In this regard, we can see that indirect speech acts constitute one of the many forms of or one of the most important forms of politeness. Whenever we have to bring in politeness in our conversation, we try to use indirect speech acts instead of saying things louder or 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 clear or direct whenever it's needed. For example, when we are talking to an elder, we probably we would and we want to ask something, we would be more indirect as compared to when we are talking to a younger one, because we are not bothered about the elements of politeness when we are talking to a younger one, but we are very much concerned about politeness when we're talking to an elder one. Indirect is so much associated with politeness that most of the directives are often expressed in interrogatives than in imperatives in order to bring in politeness. So this is because of the social dimensions, because it's the social dimension which tells us that this action, this speech act has to be performed in a different way. You cannot say that directly to an elder as you can do to a younger one. So this social dimension is so intact and so powerful in determining the meanings of many speech acts. This is especially the case with people whom one is not familiar. When we're talking to non-familiar people, we try to be more polite as compared to other situations. For example, in many British public places, for example, restaurants, hotels, and on petrol pumps and bookshops, you will generally see something written as "Thank you for not smoking." This could possibly be a simple prohibitive statement, no smoking, as we can see in our context around. But in order to look it more polite and in order to attract strangers and show your politeness in the culture, probably the British people would use this statement, "Thank you for not smoking." And in this way, they would use expressive thanking in front of the statement and would not say it directly as not smoking. And there could be other factors which could probably compel, social factors which would compel or lead people to be more polite and indirect in addition to a non-familiarity. For example, there should be reasonableness of the situation. A certain situation might require you to behave like that, or there could be a formality of the context. Context is very formal. You are in a kind of conference. You are in a talk with a boss on a serious official matter, and there could be any other formal situation in which you have to be polite. Then there could be the element of social distance. When we have a social distance, we see that there would be more politeness. This social distance could possibly be based on status, age of the speakers, their gender, education, occupation, social class, etc. There could be multiple factors, so many other factors. I give you an example. For example, when in our culture, in Eastern culture, when we talk to the other gender, for example, I being a male talking to a female, I would try to be more impolite and indirect in most of social situations, especially when I am talking to the women I am not familiar to. So I would be more polite, or most of us would be more polite in such situations. Why so? Because we have a social distance, and this distance is different from the distance which we have in Western societies. We have a wider distance in most of social situations. That's why we try to be more polite in such situations. Similarly, we try to be polite in the people who are older to us in age, who are better to us in status, and who are more educated to us, etc. So wherever there would be a social distance, there would be an element of politeness playing its role more vitally. Less dominant role and so on tend to use indirect. The people who have a less dominant role in a society or in a situation, they would use indirect way of saying things or polite way of saying things in order to convey their message to the people who are more powerful than themselves. I give you an example of a text coming from a piece of writing, Dealer's Choice. It's a story where a young woman walks into the office of a private detective who is older, male, and in a position of authority. And let's see how she says it. She got to her feet, perched on top of her boxy 4-inch wheel. And this shows shows us the situation in which she's actually walking. When she enters the room of the detective, who is obviously more powerful than her, how she talks. She says, "I have been hoping to see you, Mr. Marlowe, hoping to entrust you in taking a case for me if you have time." You see how polite and indirect it is. "I have been hoping to see you." She made it sound as though her problem, whatever it was just a bit of the dull side, and that if I didn't have time for it, the two of us could forget it and move on to something more interesting. And this comes to us from a short story, and the reaction of the person she was talking to, probably Marlowe. In this example, we can see that there is a clear example of speaking indirectly and politely to a person who is more powerful. Here she expresses our request quite indirectly, and, and that request is hidden under a representative describing herself. "I have been hoping to see you, Mr. Marlowe." So this is very polite and indirect. So we can see there are so many social dimensions of speech acts which do have an effect on their performance and their ability to make meanings in various situations.